Today's program is supported by K2 Integrity. K2 is the premier global risk advisory firm. In an ever changing world filled with uncertainties and risk, K2 helps its clients with better insights, better solutions, and better decisions. K2 Integrity, believe in better. For more, visit k2integrity.com. I'm Elaine Dezenski, and this is Coercive Capital. From anticipating supply chain disruptions and the risk of military conflict to considering the impact of tariffs and how the U.S. banking sector's assessment of doing business in China may diverge from the U.S. government's prevailing view, understanding and managing the risks for U.S. companies doing business in China is no small task. Isaac Stonefish is a scholar, author, and expert on doing business in China. He's the founder and CEO of Strategy Risks, a research and data company focused on reducing U.S. companies' exposure to China. He spent 7 years living and working there and served as Foreign Policy Magazine's Asia editor and as a Beijing correspondent for Newsweek. Isaac and I recently spoke on the evolving risks of doing business in China and his Strategy Risks Index, the SR250, that tracks China risk exposure of the top 250 public companies in the U.S. We also discussed new tariffs, trade, and China's approach in Mexico. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about how organizations can better understand and manage their exposure in China. And we're also going to touch a bit on the post-election landscape and dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship. So there's a lot to talk about these days. Congrats on your recent testimony. You recently appeared in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee on U.S. Tech companies and their relationship with China. It's a good listen for anybody who's interested in what's happening around that exposure on the tech side. So maybe just to give our listeners a better sense of you and how you come into this space of China and risk assessment. You lived in China for many years. How does China today look different from the China when you were first there?
It's a radically different place. And there's this kind of old cliche with expats that, oh yeah, it was cool in my day, or back when I was there, this was the time to be there. But I left right before Xi Jinping took power. So I left in December 2011. And despite the repression under Hu Jintao and former leaders, it's radically stepped up now. And at the same time, China is economically a lot more successful and a lot wealthier. And so you had those two things happening at the same time, the kind of increased wealth and arguably the increased concentration of wealth, but also increased surveillance, repression, a really closing space for free speech, but also economic freedom.
Yeah. And you talked about 2018 as being a turning point in the U.S.-China relationship. How so?
Three things happened that year. One was the symbolic removal of term limits for Xi Jinping's chairmanship of the country. Xi has three titles. He's the General Secretary of the Communist Party, which is the most important one because the party is the entity that rules China. He's the chairman of the Central Military Commission, which is the body that oversees the People's Liberation Army. And he's the chairman of the country. And chairman of the country is the position that they removed term limits on. And this was something that sent a strong signal in the United States that, hey, Xi Jinping was trying to lay the groundwork to be a dictator for as long as he could. The second was we started hearing credible assertions of crimes against humanity and later genocide in the northwest Chinese region of Xinjiang, where Beijing was trying to exterminate the culture, forced abortions against the Uyghur people, who are mostly Muslim people in northwest China. And it was also a time that, through a confluence of factors, it really felt like Beijing was starting to jeopardize U.S. hegemony globally. And there's a very open debate, and frankly, I'd love to see more of a debate on this about whether or not the U.S. should remain the world's hegemon. But if one doesn't believe in American exceptionalism and believes in Chinese exceptionalism instead of it, or in a true multipolar world, this is your moment. Not the viewpoints that I espouse. not the viewpoints that many elected US officials espouse. And so this, in my mind, was the year that Beijing started to be able to say globally that, hey, the era of US hegemony is over.
Yeah. That's an excellent segue into what I'd like to do at this point, which is frame the discussion around how you're thinking about and quantifying China risks. And I want to pull a quote from your recent testimony where you stated that companies with high China exposure often downplay the risks of Beijing's actions to U.S. interests, move U.S. jobs overseas, partner with businesses committing human rights abuses, and even strengthening the Communist Party. So let's start with trying to get a handle on how companies should get a handle on their China risk. I know you think about it from a methodology that includes 5 vectors. You've created a really interesting risk index, which I'd love to talk a little bit more about.
So we've created something called the SR 250, which ranks the top 250 US companies on their China exposure. And the idea is to use public information to allow both the companies themselves, but also other companies in the space, investors, and regulators to have a much better understanding of China exposure. Because Elaine, you and I share a dedication here to transparency, and we want companies in the space to be able to make better financial and regulatory decisions by understanding what companies' China exposure is. I will say, in companies' defense, it was US government policy to strengthen the Communist Party until, depending on how strictly you want to define that, 2014, 2016, 2018. And even at the tail end of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, there were policies that aimed to do capacity building, and there was a lot of legacy programs. And so companies over the last several years have had to drastically reduce those programs, and some of those still exist, and it's a good thing for companies to close. The second point I'd like to make, sort of a broad geopolitical point with the SR 250 and with broad relations between the US and China, both Beijing and Washington want companies to pick sides. And companies need to understand that that is an imperative in both Washington and Beijing. And the days when they could successfully balance between those two sides, I would argue, are very much over.
So, if I'm sitting at a public company trying to get an accurate sense of my China risks, and I know I have exposure in my supply chains, I know that I have capital at risk, how should I be thinking about the potential that the US and China may go to war in the next 5 to 10 years?
It's a great question. I think understanding that there are 3 scenarios and then planning out what it means for your business in each of those 3 scenarios. So the first, which is arguably still the base case, is high tensions but not war. The second is a limited war, limited invasion, and weak US involvement. So think Russia, Ukraine in 2014, perhaps seizing Quemoy and Matsu, small islands off the coast of China that belong to Taiwan, a couple assassinations of Taiwanese politicians, major brownouts or blackouts, something like that, or a grand bargain between the US and China over Taiwan, which could potentially happen under a Trump administration, and which in my mind is very scary in the Neville Chamberlain peace in our time type of scary. Or the third scenario, which is World War III between the US and China over Taiwan or over other geopolitical flashpoints. And while it may not seem likely, and while I, along with the rest of us humans on this world, cannot predict the future, there is enough of a possibility that this happens that companies really need to plan out what this means for their businesses. And this is an issue's very large and very small. It's about protecting your employees. It's about ensuring that you can still have access to critical technologies. It's about making sure that losing access to, say, TSMC chips or a part that, in your mind is only made in some small factory in Fuzhou doesn't pose an existential threat to your business. It's a very long laundry list of items that could prove the difference between a bumper quarter or a very poor quarter, and in some businesses' case could be the end of business if they don't plan this correctly.
Mm-hmm. So I've often wondered, again, from a corporate perspective, when you look at emerging challenges like China's national intelligence law, some of the pressure on business executives who've either been detained or gone through some serious administrative bureaucracy. There are some scenarios that you can plan for, and then a lot of scenarios that you can't plan for. What do you advise a company, trying to understand, for example, the implications of the national intelligence law and whether Chinese nationals working for them may be a risk?
So there's no way of doing business without risk. All business is risk, and there's U.S. risk, there's Canada risk, there's risk doing business in Massachusetts. However you want to strike it, there's no safe way to do business. That said, our overarching viewpoint is that businesses have long underplayed and mispriced China risk, and the risk to them is higher than they think. And so, from a very macro perspective, it's pricing in all of the possibilities that you talked about. It's pricing in the, hey, I had this partnership with an SOE, state-owned enterprise, a company that is wholly or majority owned by the Communist Party, and the head of the SOE is now in prison. And so what does that mean for the safety of my employees? What does that mean for my business? The former chairman of one of the major Chinese state banks went to jail for corruption. And so you'd think about that when you're doing business in the financial sector in China, and you think, oh, great, I'm going to work with Bank of China or ICBC because they're safe. But when the head of the business that you were working with is in jail allegedly for corruption, that is not a safe play. And so understanding that that can cause real problems for you in China. The major China risks that companies face is, in fact, not US government or US pressure. It's what Beijing does. It's the strong leftward turn under Xi Jinping. It's the closing space for private businesses. And it's the reason that the wealthiest and smartest entrepreneurs in China are almost all, without exception, looking for ways to themselves reduce their China exposure. And so it's a really important message to deliver, because there's this sense among folks who talk about this or among the public that the risk for US businesses in China is the US government. And certainly that's a risk, and certainly that's something that they need to manage. But a far bigger risk for them is the Communist Party. And so understanding that and understanding the difficulties of engaging with the Communist Party today is a really, really important risk for businesses to understand.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And maybe switching to the angle of what the U.S. government should be doing to help U.S. companies operating in China, are there aspects that the government isn't considering or should be doing at this point to either help companies understand that risk, mitigate that risk, incentives, more incentives maybe to build out alternative supply chains? What does that look like from your viewpoint?
With the caveat that with the Trump election, we might see some pretty large changes with the way incentives are structured and with the role that government plays in businesses. If the Department of Government Efficiency has its way, a lot of the carrots will be cut, and then some of the sticks as well, because there won't be people to enforce them. That said, this is very much a developing story. What US businesses need to understand is that in most cases, the government doesn't want them to be doing business in China, and it wants to be communicating to them that, hey, you're out of luck here. You got yourself into this mess, and we're not going to get you out of it. And big US companies have been trying for years to lobby against that viewpoint. And we see that especially with companies like Boeing or Apple or Microsoft, companies that have very influential lobbying arms and are heavily exposed to China. They want support for their position there, but frankly, there's not a huge amount of sympathy from folks in the US government for the way that these companies are so exposed. And it was something that was, very shocking to a lot of the business leaders that we talked to several years ago. Just hey, we're having a really hard time here. How can I get the U.S. government to help? And having to explain to them that the U.S. government wants you to be elsewhere. And so one of the things that we advise companies on doing is having proactive plans that they can present to their US government partners, showing how they're reducing their China exposure or showing how they're not working with problematic entities inside the Chinese system.
So I want to switch our focus a bit to talk about the incoming Trump administration and the huge discussion underway on tariffs on China, how that will impact companies that have China exposure, and what that means in terms of potentially accelerating some of this de-risking or decoupling out of China, or potentially having other impacts. What do you think about that?
It's a fascinating interplay between a presidency that will, on the one hand, have some very important restrictions, and on the other hand, have fewer regulations, and perhaps from a meaningful point of view, and perhaps from a meaningful stance, much weaker regulations. So the big question with regulations in the Trump administration is what's going to be enforced and what's not. And frankly, this is true in most administrations. It's a question of enforcement as opposed to law. Tariffs are so incredibly important to Trump and to many senior people in his administration that it almost doesn't matter who gets senior positions in USTR and Treasury. And I know, by the time this airs, those should be hopefully clear. But businesses need to understand that the US government under Trump does not want them to be so entangled with China. And there's going to be a huge reorienting of supply chains. It's already happening now because prices across the board are shifting. And we're going to see a lot of issues of companies that supply to major US companies moving even quicker to Vietnam, to Mexico, to Indonesia, to Morocco, and trying to ship from there to the United States. And depending on the intricacies of the law, doing that sometimes legally and sometimes not.
Yeah. I think it's also possible that we may see some flow of more Chinese capital coming into the U.S. Because with additional restrictions, the operating model for a supply chain based in the U.S. may look better. So that's kind of an interesting twist as well.
That's an excellent point. And I think that's something that Trump would appreciate and would consider a victory. And many people in his administration would not appreciate.
Yeah, I see both sides of that. On the one hand, foreign direct investment that helps to reindustrialize the U.S. has value. On the other hand, what's the composition of those deals, that capital, the intellectual property involved? Are we actually increasing our exposure versus decreasing it when it comes to dependency on China? I think we're going to have a lot of interesting questions. And when you think about how many deals might actually go through the Committee on Foreign Investment, that threshold that needs to be met, it won't be all deals. It won't be all foreign direct investment coming from a place like China or anywhere for that matter. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the potential that we see a lot more Chinese investment in the U.S.
I think that's very interesting. I think it very much is a possibility. And I think it also will depend on state laws. And I think if it does happen, I would it's fascinating to think about. I think right now I'd expect it to come into blue states because I think red states are going to signal that they are not friendly to Chinese investment. I think what we will see is companies with Chinese investment, but minority Chinese investment, then investing in red states. One can imagine joint ventures between Gulf countries and Chinese entities, investing heavily in Texas, Florida.
Yeah, Mexico. Yeah.
Yes.
And certainly in the Western Hemisphere, when we think about all the plays around critical minerals, processing, I think that's very likely. actually, this confluence of funding from the Middle East and from Asia coming together to identify the best deals. And again, we're going to be faced with this question. Uh, do we see these investments as opportunities to rebuild our own industrial base, or do we see them as risks? Or are they some combination of both? Which I think is why we have such a dilemma. um, so, what do you think? I mean, is there a model for the U.S. and China to economically coexist in peace and meet U.S. national security objectives?
No, I think there's a model for the US and China to coexist in peace, but it doesn't meet US national security objectives. I think the model for the US and China to coexist in peace is either predicated on a massive realignment of the Communist Party's priorities or the US removing or drastically reducing its presence in Asia. So the easiest way to prevent a war between the US and China is to give up Taiwan, is to move troops out of Japan and move troops out of South Korea and say, China, Asia is your backyard, and we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere and Europe. To be clear, I do not advocate for this position, but that is the way to prevent war. And I think it's very difficult to say because one doesn't want to allow for a cataclysmic conflict between the two sides. It's hard to imagine World War III without tens, if not hundreds of millions of people dying. It could be a very different type of war, but when the world goes to war, there's massive, massive cost for human life. I think we need to have a national debate about the goals of the US globally. Trump with America First is, one could interpret America First as America needs to be first globally and in the United States. But for Trump and for many people on his team, it seems to be much more of we have to focus on home and we have to prioritize American interests domestically to American interests globally. There's been quite a fall of the neocons, and this is not, in many cases, an expansionist administration. It's the opposite. And depending on how the U.S. engages with China on that, it could be a great opportunity for China to expand globally. China is, of course, facing an economic crisis and possibly a political crisis of its own. I like to see the Chinese governance model as a series of crises constantly erupting. So it's very difficult to say, but it's my firm belief that these issues are way too important to just be in the podcast sphere and need to be debated across the country.
Yeah, I agree. There's really too much at risk. And I think it's almost impossible to pull domestic policy away from foreign policy around these issues. And it's because supply chains run from end to end. I don't know how we would have a conversation about reindustrializing this country without rethinking or at least considering foreign policy decisions and discussions around China. There's really no way to do that. And one question that I think we need to be able to answer is, what do we mean by economic security? What does that actually mean? Are we talking about economic prosperity? Because if that's the lens, then we might look at foreign direct investment in a certain way. Is it protection from authoritarian influence and trying to push back on that in a more meaningful way? That might lead us to a different set of policies. So, yeah, I agree. There's much to be discussed. From the financial perspective, it would be interesting to get your thinking on how banks and other financial institutions should be thinking about China risks, and whether you think there's any sort of disconnect with how politicians view China risk and how the banking community might view that.
There's a massive disconnect between politicians and the banking community because the politicians are much more hawkish on China than the banking community is. And politicians do not see the financial opportunity with engaging with China. That's not their interests, and the banking community does. I'd say from a compliance perspective, We strongly encourage banks to better screen for China exposure and China risks, and to better screen not only for what is a sanctions violation today and what is a violation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which restricts exports from Xinjiang into the United States, but things that very easily could be a sanctions violation tomorrow. Because it's much harder. It's usually for these transactions, as folks in the financial community know, it's not oh, we invested in a sanctioned entity or an entity that later became sanctioned. I'm just going to flip a switch and this investment is going to be unwound. It's, oh, this is weeks, months, possibly even longer of careful paperwork and negotiations and many stakeholders and very complex deals and transactions. And we strongly encourage financial institutions, especially those, the people in those institutions in compliance, to understand that there is today a real risk with investing in or partnering with the People's Liberation Army. That is the army in China, but there's a really important point to be made about the army. And it sounds crazy to say, but it's the reality of China today. China does not have an army. The Communist Party has an army. The PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party. It is not the army of the nation. It's similar to Vietnam, North Korea, Laos. It's a communist legacy. Imagine if the Ohio National Guard was the standing army of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in Ohio. And that's a way of understanding how the PLA operates. So the PLA is a lot more entangled in businesses and has in some ways its own business interests, and entities that are either part of the PLA or have close ties to the PLA could very well be on the future sanctions lists, and banks need to price in the risk of that. And again, it's not saying, hey, don't invest in anything the PLA touches. It's saying you need to price in this risk now because these companies have a higher than average chance of being sanctioned in the future.
Today's program is supported by K2 Integrity, the premier global risk advisory firm. In today's world, threats can arise anywhere, at any time. Threats to your organization's operations, financial stability, or reputation. K2 offers a better way to counter the threats facing your organization. K2 provides critical intelligence and actionable strategies to uncover the truth, make decisions, and reduce risk. K2 helps you face critical challenges with an experienced team and the ability to navigate the most complex issues to arrive at better outcomes. That's why clients partner with K2, to help them thrive in an ever-changing world filled with uncertainties and risk. By providing better insights, better solutions, and better decisions. K2 Integrity. Believe in better. For more, visit k2integrity.com. So, what about some of the dynamics around the domestic economy in China? What do you see in terms of there've now been there's some shock therapy, right, from Beijing trying to kickstart the Chinese economy. They have some structural issues. They have demographic issues. They have, problems in terms of global growth and global demand for their products. Does all of this lead them more quickly, like in the next few years, towards that transition from being an export-driven economy to strengthening domestic demand and domestic consumption?
The real purpose to strengthen domestic demand, domestic consumption, is to decouple from reliance on unfriendly countries, mostly the United States. And so it's less of an economic imperative. When we talk about economic security in the United States, it's so much more of a priority for Beijing because these issues are so much more important to them. And they're far more worried about the United States at a high level than the US appears to be on China. So we need to understand the domination of politics and national security in Communist Party thinking. The second thing I'll say about China's economy is it's always been an information poor environment, and that has gotten much worse. And so we're in this very funny situation where the economic numbers don't really reflect reality. And so, we have senses and we have ways of guessing at China's economic growth or the lack of it, but the numbers are so much less trusted, even among the bureaucrats who put out the numbers. And so we're in this funny situation where we have all this data. It's never a question of scarcity of data. There's so much data. It's just very difficult to know what to trust and what not to. And so talking about China's economy is much more difficult because of that. The final thing I'll say, and I think this is especially true on demography, is that I do feel like there's a real chance of a major, major shock, whether that be war or something else, that will make it very difficult to predict where things are going. I have a lot of conversations with people who say, I'm really worried about China's demographic decline in the 2030s. And I say, well, I'm really worried about today and the next couple of years. And so businesses like to predict far out in the future. That's very difficult because they need to price in the possibility of war. The final thing I'll say about this is there's this very annoying Orientalist viewpoint in America that Chinese people think in decades or they think in centuries. They don't. They think like human beings. They think about the near term and sometimes they think about the long term. I would encourage folks who disagree with me to read a Chinese 5-year plan and then look at how the economy developed, and we'll find how radically different they are. China's economy would be so much smaller and the country would be so much less successful if they actually followed their plans. We all know what happened to the Soviet Union when they tried to follow their 5-year plans. It's a really poor way to run an economy. And so people will listen to Xi Jinping saying things like, oh, here's our carbon targets in 2060, and think that's a reality or a reality he can create as opposed to something that is just artful misdirection.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. It's an interesting angle, and actually, it's a little bit. I feel a little bit better about our capacity for short-term thinking in this country versus long-term, and that maybe it's human nature to move more towards short-term thinking. But we also have to factor in the pace of innovation, which is also fueling, right, a lot of these longer-term plans and ways of thinking about economic security and over the long haul. I mean, so much of that is technology-driven, and that's moving pretty quickly. I want to go back to the issue of transparency because it's a favorite topic. So you mentioned the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We have a lot of opacity when it comes to the Chinese market, whether we're talking about trade data, deeper supply chain data of all kinds, what's coming in and out of ports, what might be relabeled transshipments to avoid certain kinds of tariffs. I think we have a huge problem here, but we also have a huge opportunity. And no matter what we do on tariffs, export controls, some of these other kind of hard-hitting blunt force instruments, there is a lot more that we could be doing to drive transparency across supply chains. How do you think we should exploit that opportunity with more pro-transparency laws or regulations, or is it really an issue of enforcement that we really need to ramp up in that regard?
It's a great question. First, I'll say we find this to be so important that we make opacity one of the 5 categories in our SR 250 so that we can reward companies for being open about how they break out revenue and other details about their China business, and then penalize companies that don't want to talk about it. I think one major issue of financial transparency as it comes to China is companies are often coy about what is China, what is Hong Kong, and what is Taiwan, because they'll lump their Taiwan business in, and then that'll upset people in the States, or they'll break it out and then it'll upset people in China and especially upset the Communist Party. There's this very silly financial term of Asia ex Japan, which is most of the world. And so you use that and you say, hey, here's our business in Asia ex Japan. And you just think that's so incredibly broad. And then, as you know, there's so many ways to not book profits in certain areas, so that you have, say, a BVI holding British Virgin Islands holding company that does business in China but earns profits elsewhere, or earns profits in Ireland, and that allows you to say, hey, we're not the business, we're not making money in China, we're making money in Ireland or in the Caymans or in another jurisdiction. I'd say from a regulatory perspective, it's it's creating a sea change. The goal is to create a sea change so that companies feel like details around their China exposure are things that they need to expose. And we've seen this with DEI, we've seen this with climate change, and we'd love to see this with geopolitical risk, and we'd love to see this with China, where companies understand that if they don't disclose these things, they're going to face shareholder lawsuits, they're going to face uncomfortable questions from US senatorial committees, and they're going to face frustrations from their customers and from their shareholders.
Yeah. So we know Elon Musk has a lot of China exposure through Tesla and other interests. And we also know that Chinese companies are ramping up their lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. Are there vulnerabilities in the system that you think China will aim to exploit further in the next few years?
I don't envy the position that Elon Musk is in. He is atop the world's most difficult balancing act. How does he manage Trump's ego, manage his own ego, manage his relationship with the top of the Communist Party, and manage one of the world's most important weapons company, SpaceX, while at the same time manage a business that's heavily exposed to China and the Chinese Communist Party? And for a long time, people have been predicting that something has to give with the various business interests that Musk has run. And so far, you got to hand it to the guy. Like him or not, he's done a fantastic job of growing and of working his way to the top of US power. I think there's a broad consensus that at some point his relationship with Trump will fray. There's just too much ego in that partnership, and one person will have to win, and you just assume it will be the president of the United States and not the world's richest man. We'll see. We'll be watching with popcorn avidly. I think from what Beijing is doing and can do, they love to leverage their interests and relationships with the US business community to push for their interests in Washington. And so we'll see that not just with Tesla, but with Apple, with Microsoft, with Boeing. Steven Schwartzman, who is the head of Blackstone and the founder of Schwartzman Scholars, which is a Rhodes Scholar-like program out of Tsinghua, the party university that is the school where Xi Jinping went. He is going to be probably a potent lever of influence from Beijing to Washington. And so that's another one that we should watch very carefully.
Fascinating. Thank you. Final question. What do you think about some of the emerging China risks for North America? We have a revision on the US-Mexico-Canada agreement coming up in 2026. Already a lot of discussion about that and whether that review process will be just a review or whether it may get opened up in light of some of the other national security risks, border challenges, fentanyl, supply chain issues, and more specifically, China's investment into Mexico. And we know, for instance, on the EV side, there's plenty of Chinese EVs coming into Mexico. They're not coming across the border to the US. That part we've managed. But Mexico's industrial base could look very different in a decade if there is a huge influx of Chinese investment. What are your thoughts on North America?
So it's an excellent time for Chinese companies to invest in Mexico because the top three policy priorities for the Trump administration in Mexico are immigration, immigration, and immigration. 4 is fentanyl. And anything related to China, it cannot be in the top. And so if the Mexico administration plays ball on immigration and really helps Trump deliver a win on immigration policy and removing illegal immigrants from the United States, and does it in a way that doesn't cause a massive distracting upheaval in a way that the Republicans don't want. They like some of that, but there's a degree to which they would find unacceptable. If Mexico does that, I think they'll have a lot of opportunity to take in a lot of Chinese investment. And that'll be a real issue for US businesses, both those that are going to compete with Mexican businesses or Chinese businesses in Mexico, but also for US policymakers who are worried about goods made with forced labor in Xinjiang being shipped into Mexico as a way into the United States, or also those who worry about jobs in the United States from competition in Mexico. Canada is surprisingly, in some ways, more hawkish on China than the United States. And frankly, it's been more hawkish on TikTok, which has been heartening to see. And so we don't expect that to change. We feel like Canada might, in some ways, outshine the United States on their way of putting up restrictions. The issue for Canada is going to be a lot of liberalization in US laws towards environmental policy, which could change the US Canada energy relationship and could change the costs of drilling and of exploiting minerals. It's also going to have a major impact on the global mineral trade because the environmental laws in the United States, for better or for worse, might be weakened enough that it becomes more cost effective to drill or to process various rare earths here. One of the major reasons, and perhaps the main reason why China dominates the global market for minerals processing and for rare earths, is because they care a lot less about the environmental degradation and the cost of, say, processing thallium and other pollutants that come out from a mining work. And so we might see a really big change with that as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Isaac. This has been super interesting, and hope to have you back on the show again.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions and the great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Reading the tea leaves of the US-China relationship is challenging, even in times of relative calm. But of course, the present moment is anything but certain. And companies can't afford to treat geopolitical risks as outliers. I can't think of a more articulate voice on navigating the challenges ahead for US companies operating in China than Isaac Stone-Fish. Isaac lays out some of the major considerations for companies looking to reduce uncertainty and better prepare for a turbulent period ahead. For more on his expertise on the matter, I highly recommend his book, America's Second: How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. Thanks for joining me. I'm Elaine Dezenski, and this is Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network.